I'm Arnie Fine.
And I'm Susan Fine.
And we are longtime supporters of and certainly involved and have been involved with Federation dating back for a very long time. In fact, Susan's uncle, may he rest in peace, was the first president of Federation, if I recall.
He was, and I recall actually sitting on the board of, it was called Fund and Council before it became Federation. So I was, a teenager, of course, but no, it was a long time ago. And so we have a long history with Federation.
Both of us were on the board at the same time for many years. I was president from 2001 to 2003. And I think the most distinguishing characteristic, not necessarily good or bad, but just distinguishing characteristic for the two of us was that, and Susan will remember the year, I don't, but we were the first husband and wife team to head the general campaign. And what I mean by that is not that Susan headed the women's division and I was head of the general campaign. We were a husband and wife team who headed the general campaign together. And I think that year, Susan will remember later, Jerry London was head of the women's campaign. And the reason we did that is when I was asked to chair the campaign, I knew that Susan was going to be work just as hard as I was going to be. So I accepted the request on the one condition that my wife could be my co-chair, and most people agreed that Susan was better than I was for the task anyway. So it was.
We had specialization of labor.
Yeah, she did the labor, and I know. But we did it together, and it made it. It actually made. Well, I don't know about fun because it's a lot of work, and people say it's fun. I don't know about fun, but it was rewarding. Let's put it that way, and it was much more rewarding to do it together.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a bit about what it was that got you involved with Federation at all in the first place?
Well, I think moving here, we both moved here from Calgary, so we got involved in the Jewish community because it was a good way of getting to know other Jewish people in Vancouver. And for me, I can't speak for Arnie, but for me it was...
That's a change.
It was also something I felt strongly about. I grew up in a very Zionist-focused family and had been to Israel when I was a teenager, and felt a strong bond, and it was sort of an automatic thing that we would get involved in Federation.
Well, when I came here, part of what got me involved in Federation was I was a university student at UBC, and Hillel House was there. The Jewish community of Vancouver sort of became known to me as a university student, and Hillel House played for a few years a very important role in my life in assimilating into Vancouver. I met a lot of friends there who I still have today, and there was no Federation then. It was still UJA, or
Funded Council.
But that introduced it to me, and then mainly when our children started at Talmud Torah. I was involved in the Talmud Torah, on the board in Talmud Torah for a long time, and then Federation was formed, and Susan's uncle was the first president in 1987, we decided?
87, yeah.
1987. And so it was a natural progression to go from sort of your specific involvement with the particular institution your kids were at, which then was Talmud Torah.
And Camp Atikva.
Yeah, and Camp Atikva.
I want to forget about Camp Atikva.
To then, Federation. And then from there, Federation really, for a long time, was a very important part of our lives.
And we got you to Israel finally. We got Arnie to Israel, and once he started...
I'm afraid of guns. I had many opportunities to go to Israel, and as much as I always was a strong Zionist, it bothers me when I see a police officer in Vancouver with a gun. I'm a chicken. I don't like guns.
But once we got him to Israel, then he kept wanting to go back. We went on several missions, and it sort of grew from there. I'd like to also mention not only being involved, on the board of Federation, but we both sat on the board of the foundation, which through the years, I think, we've watched that morph from a very small beginning to now over $42 million in the foundation, which I think is something also we're really extremely proud of.
Well, that was being looked at. was it formed when I was president? But I think the foundation is the most important.
Yeah, it was.
Over time will become, hopefully, the most important institution here because it'll be stable.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that the foundation be nurtured and promoted, because I think that really makes the difference in the long run if you have a stable, somewhere a large source of funds that you can count on when there's a recession or whatever and your campaigns change. And I think it's really important. I read some of the questions you were interested in doing this research, and one of them was, what are the most important changes, or do we view as our contribution? I think no retrospect on this federation can be done without a huge call-up for Mark Gervis.
We were both involved on the search committee at the time that hired Mark. And I think looking back, if we look back over all the years and all of our involvement in Federation, that was probably, to us, the turning point of Federation, because in many ways, before Mark came in, it was still kind of a mom-and-pop shop organization in many senses. And Mark really turned Federation around, and it became a real professional.
Mark Gervis achieved that, and I think it transformed Federation into what, in my opinion, today, people look to Federation now. Agencies look to Federation for two reasons.
And the foundation.
The foundation. They receive money, of course, but they also receive leadership. Federation is doing, takes the demographics and looks at what the needs are in the broad community, and truly is partners now with other agencies. They don't just throw money at them, they help at least that's my perception now, and I think it's changed the whole community. And like I say, there's a lot of people involved in that process over the last 30 years. I think the catalyst to make it really happen was Mark Gervis, who he recruited professionally in the office, and the level of community leader involvement he achieved. And I think it's one of the bedrocks of what made Federation, I think, a much better organization today than it was 30 years ago, for sure.
Can you talk to us a bit about the specific challenges that the campaign that year or the community as a whole were facing then, and how they've changed over time, perhaps, to what we're dealing with today?
I think the first thing that would come to mind for me was the lack of involvement and mindset of philanthropy among our peers at the time, because we were 40 years old, and most of pretty well all of the major donors were the elders of the community. And a lot of young people were professionals. They were doing very well. Vancouver was not nearly as expensive a city to live in those days. But for some reason, there was a lack of involvement by people our age. And, certainly to chair the campaign, we were the youngest, because most of the chairs at that point were in their 60s, maybe their late 50s, but nobody our age. So that was a challenge, and we tried to get some of our peers involved.
And I think that's the biggest difference now, is on every level.
Or else we're getting older, maybe, and that's why they seem younger. But I do think that a lot of younger people now are involved, and when we go to these events, we see a lot of faces that are new to us and are so young compared to...
Well, that is just us aging.
Well, that is part of it, too, but we used to go to these events, and it would really just be the older
and the same old people.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is the scope of who Federation has reached out to, not just for money, but certainly for money. The number of donors, I haven't looked at statistics lately, the number of donors must be way up. And off a broad spectrum. And, it's hard to grow your campaign with the same people every year in and year out. And I think as Federation matured and under
I was going to say under
leadership.
Mark. I think Mark did a lot.
Yeah, the tentacles reached out, and people and organizations are seeing the fruits of that now. I mean, Federation, I think in our year, I can't remember if it was 3.8 or 4.1 million we raised in our year. I can't remember which it was. I don't know why those two numbers are in my mind.
And there were 16 agencies, I think, at that time. Okay. And so now
today the campaign is 8.5 million plus. Well, that's a lot. of an increase. And part of it is the professionalism. You know, when you ask what are the differences, the budget for Federation itself, in terms of overhead and salaries, was pretty low back in those days. And
most
because
of it was
nobody,
volunteer-driven,
and
too.
most of the elders, what I remember, were very much against paying a lot of money to
Well, they're very
professionals.
skeptical of
and
paying
that because they were used to their day when really it was volunteer work did most of it. And of course, we've now seen, if you take the raw dollars that I'm sure go to Federation, I'm sure it's way higher than it used to be, but if you take it as a percentage of what money we're raising, I'll bet it's way less than it was even then.
Yeah, it was a good investment
And, yeah,
to bring in the
it was a good
professionals.
investment. I mean, I remember speaking to your uncle, and when he heard, I think he asked me the year we hired, when we were on the search committee to hire Mark Irvis, and I can't remember what we paid him, and I guess I shouldn't say it, even if I could remember. But it was not insignificant compared to the past. And your uncle climbed up one side of the wall and went down the other. And I said, Uncle Bob, I said, it's a new world. I said, it's going to make a
Well, I think he would be the
difference.
first to admit now if he was here, it was worth the investment.
If he was alive, he would say, wow,
Yeah.
that worked.
Yeah, it made a huge difference.
It's a different mindset, totally.
Hey, not sure if it was specifically your idea, but something that bubbled up in that campaign year was something called Plus Giving.
Yep.
Could you talk to us a little bit about what that is?
Go ahead.
Oh, well, it wasn't our idea. I
heard it
think I
somewhere.
went to a seminar when I was on the board at the time, and then was asked to chair the campaign. And somebody mentioned to me that they were using it, I don't know, somewhere in the States. And the minute I heard the notion, I liked it. And the notion was that because we had flat donors for a long time. And you would say to a donor, well, why don't you give more? Well, I'm giving to Talmatora this year also, or I'm giving whatever it may be. So when I heard this notion of plus giving, that if you gave an increase, you could direct 50% or 75% of it, the idea was we could tell a donor, well, look, if you give an increase this year, you can give
You could
whatever
direct it to your
percent, you could
favorite
direct it to your favorite
agency,
thing.
yeah.
I did go around. You didn't come with me when I did that. I don't know why. Susan and I chaired it as we sat together. But I went to see many of the major donors, many of the flat donors, not just major donors. So I went around to, I think, 10 of them, and then I went around to flat donors, and then I went around to people in general and just said, what do you think of this idea? And universally, it was, gee, that's a good idea. And it was interesting because one of the major donors at that time, and someone who I knew to be very smart, he says, well, it's a good gimmick for this year, but what are you going to do next year? and I said, yeah, I didn't think of that. And he said, run with it.
Well, there's always a hook. You've got to have something every year.
Yeah, he said, run with it.
That has worked, yeah.
And it did raise a lot of additional pledges. People liked it. And I think still today they do it. And so I can't take credit for the idea, but we instituted it. And it was funny because they had to redo the cards, right? They had to reprint all. I mean, there were logistics involved in doing that. Yeah. They had to reprint the cards to ask for plus giving.
And retrain the volunteers.
Yeah, we had to retrain all the volunteers. And
yeah, but it was good. And I think it brought some excitement to the campaign, if you can call it exciting, or there was some excitement, and people did feel more of a connection. And the fact that it's hung around now for all these years.
Well, I remember at one point,
something good.
It was on Talmatora board somewhere, whatever agency it was, like they got 40 or 50 grand in plus giving.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money, at least it was then.
It still is.
When you think back of all your involvement as a whole with Federation, were there any personal rewards that you feel you've walked away with?
Well, one thing that pops up in my mind, probably one of the most long-lasting experiences for me was I went as a chaperone on March of the Living. I was sort of asked to do that at the last moment because they were short a chaperone, and as it turned out, our 16-year-old daughter, was on that trip, but they needed an extra chaperone, and I went. And knowing, because our daughter Carly was going, quite a bit about the program, we had already gone through some orientation, but participating in that trip was really an amazing experience, not just for all the kids, but for me personally, and a trip I'll never forget. And so now I know Federation is helping to fund those trips, which Federation wasn't in those days, but is now, and I think it's a fantastic a fantastic way to invest our money. It was a great trip. And I would also say the missions that we participated in were wonderful, just wonderful ways to really cement that connection to Israel, and then to come home and be reinvigorated to go and do some of this work, which sometimes is, a little tedious or difficult to ask people for money year after year, but it just sort of reinvigorates you. So those two things to me.
I never had trouble asking people for money. I really didn't.
You asked why you were a good campaign.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it's not like you're asking for yourself. And no one you ever called wasn't getting one way or another a benefit from money raised in the Jewish community. So I was unabashed in canvassing cards. But what Susan said is specifically for me, being involved with Federation, certainly the year we headed the campaign, and we went on the mission to Israel. I had never been to Israel, and then we went, 8 or 9 times. We went on a lot of missions, and that really cemented for me a connection to Israel, and a connection also, in those days, and I'm sure it still goes on today, we're not sitting in the boardrooms anymore, but there's always a discussion about how much money are we going to give to Israel, how much money are we going to keep in the local community. And those discussions, I'm sure, will never go away, because it changes. When fundraising first began, and I wasn't around, but listening to Lore, it was to raise money for Israel, for a new state. And that's what people were giving their money for. And eventually there were still local needs, but we didn't have the buildings we have now, and we didn't have the wealth we had now, and we didn't have the philanthropy we have now. So over time, because I remember being on canvassing, people would say, well, I don't want to give to Federation because none of the money goes to Israel. And I would say, well, no, I wouldn't say none of the money goes. Yeah, but too much of it isn't going to Israel, it's staying in the local community. So, I'm sure those discussions are still going on in boardrooms, because that changes. And I'm sure for Vancouver probably being discussed in boardrooms today is how are we going to keep young, working, professional people involved in philanthropy and supporting our institutions.
And connected.
Because this is an expensive city.
Connected to being Jewish, too, because that has really changed over time. We were just talking about this the other day, how for most young people, to have a connection to their Judaism, so to speak, to belong to a synagogue, to send your kids to the Jewish day schools or to camps. It's extremely expensive now.
If they want to put a roof over their heads near the Talmud Torah to use it, chances are they're not going to be able to afford the Talmud Torah.
Yeah.
So the question is, are they going to say to themselves, I think I'll get a roof over my head in Surrey, which probably isn't cheap either, or in the outlying areas, and then how am I going to get my kids to Talmud Torah?
So maybe they won't go. And Talmud Torah, relative to years ago when our kids were there, is very expensive now because of the other expenses being so much more.
Well,
so that's a challenge. That's a huge challenge.
Well, we have a granddaughter, and our daughter tells me what it costs for her now to go to kindergarten at Talmud Torah.
These are the challenges
Huge
now
challenge.
that I think, the Jewish community is no longer sort of centered around 41st and Oak. It hasn't been for many, many years, and these are a lot of challenges now. And between the cost of keeping Jewish and keeping those connections, and the rate of intermarriage, which is 50%. So there are a lot of challenges.
And I'm sure there are people sitting around pulling their hair out.
But you don't want the Talmud Torah to become a school for the rich and the poor. You want the middle class to have a place there too. And so that will be the challenge, is raising that kind of money to be able to help subsidize the now middle class who are falling behind.
Well, Bernie Sanders says everybody in the United States should have free university. Why can't we have free Jewish day schools?
Well, maybe that's a new challenge, a new plus giving mantra.